Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to All Era Sports with Sirhan, coming to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America on this 22nd of January, 2026. Here's hoping everyone had themselves a wonderful day today. I will get right down to it here real quick. For those of you that are new in one of my segments, this is something I like to do called a legendary night, spun off the boxing series HBO had years back. I do it on my own with fights that HBO should have touched but didn't. But decided to do it on my own to give one historical night its own time slot because it's well deserved. I did it for this one last year, but because of how it was, it's something I probably do on this day every year moving forward. And it stems from an event that took place 53 years ago tonight in Kingston, Jamaica. It was the fight everyone wanted, and this is what you want in heavyweight boxing, and everybody got it. It was the undefeated heavyweight champion Joe Frazier taking on the undefeated number one contender George Foreman for the ultimate prize, the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. I'll touch on their fight, touch on their careers, and given this involves a coming out party, I'll touch on some of the most historic and explosive coming out parties in heavyweight boxing history, because what I talk about is probably the gold standard of it. And little did we know, this was going to spark off a phenom, not just in boxing, but in all of pop culture, because this guy became a larger than life figure and a household name. You probably see both of them did, but for the winner, it was bigger than not even he could even tell you. We'll start with the champion first. This is Smoking Joe Frazier. Nobody knows this. He was originally born in South Carolina before he went to Philadelphia. 1964 Olympic gold medalist. That's one thing few don't talk about when we talk about Joe Frazier. Was his amateur background. A 1964 Olympic gold medalist in the games in Tokyo. He lost its finals to Buster Mathis Sr., but Buster Mathis Sr. was forced to pull out due to a hand injury, and Joe Frazier stepped in. But here's one thing people forget. Joe Frazier himself had a hand injury, but he said, I'm going to go through with it. And he went to the 1964 Olympics to represent the United States and took home gold and a stunning run to represent the United States and win this gold medal in the 1964 Olympics. And it was shortly, about a little more than a year after, he went ahead and turned professional, master a record of 24-0 before he got a title shot against Jimmy Ellis. Now we know why the title shot came about. It's because of what happened to Muhammad Ali, the reasons why he was forced to vacate his title. I'm not using my platform for it, so I think you guys know what that is. So the titles became vacant, and because Ali was in exile, Joe Frazier got a shot at the title against Jimmy Ellis at Madison Square Garden. Now, on his way to getting to that point, Frazier had some quality wins over guys like Buster Mathis Sr., we mentioned, who lost to the Olympics, Oscar Buenavela, George Chuvalo, and of course, the tough Jerry Quarry, which set him up for this opportunity. And in this particular fight against Jimmy Ellis, who was a standout light heavyweight for the longest time, Joe Frazier just went in there and just pulverized Jimmy Ellis to the tune of a fourth round knockout to hit his pedestal to become the heavyweight champion of the world on the night of February 16, 1970. And he was the man amongst boys. He was a champion, but wasn't accepted given that Muhammad Ali lost his titles. But remember, he didn't lose his titles in the ring. He lost it for reasons, and we know what those reasons are. And that's why Joe Frazier got to that point and wasn't accepted. The only way he was going to be accepted is to have a fight with Muhammad Ali. But on his way to that point, he had hit in the middle. He fought standout light heavyweight Bob Foster, who he just pulverized in 2 rounds. And after that Foster win by knockout, that set up the giant March 8, 1971 fight of the century at Madison Square Garden between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier for Frazier's undisputed heavyweight championship. We know the wild build-up on that one, the hatred that was going on. But one thing few people don't even know is, given what happened to Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier went to bat for Ali during his time in exile, but Ali didn't accept it, and that's why the rivalry between Ali and Frazier went to high levels going into this fight, with all kinds of names being called, all kinds of strong names being called. I'm not going to use a platform to just tell you what those are. And that's what led to the riot, and that's what led to, I just say, a scuffle and a real feud between the two fighters verbally. And that led to a huge buildup for what turned out to be the fight of the century as it was billed for March 8, 1971, between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. The story of this one was it was a back and forth pace where Frazier got off strong, Ali came back, and it was Frazier and then Ali, all kinds of exchanges back and forth until the capper was round 15 when the left hook by Frazier floored Ali to seal the unanimous decision win to retain his heavyweight championship. And probably the greatest heavyweight championship fight in boxing history. And that's what Frazier-Ali won was. And of course, it ignited that historic rivalry moving forward. But moving forward after that, it was Frazier who moved on to face a couple fighters like mainly Terry Daniels and Ron Stander, getting fourth round knockouts in each fight to retain his championship on those particular fights. But it was in the middle of those, between the Ali fight and what we're about to talk about, was when the boxing world was introduced to the number one contender at that time, and it happens to be none other than the guy he fought on this night 53 years ago in Kingston, Jamaica, Big George Foreman. Out of Marshall, Texas, the story, the troubled childhood earlier in his life, took up boxing, obviously. Went, like Joe Frazier, who won a gold medal in 1964, George Foreman represented the United States in Mexico City in 1968, where he powered his way to the gold medal. And one of the more wipeouts, maybe in Olympic boxing history at the time, where you consider Foreman just knocked everybody out. And that's what George Foreman did on his way to the gold medal. And one thing before I proceed, here's something we don't talk about in the heavyweight division. I said the 70s was a golden era. It was dominated by three guys: Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, and George Foreman. This started in the Olympics in 1960. We talk about Muhammad Ali winning the gold medal in 1960. Back then he was known as Cassius Clay. Joe Frazier in 1964. And George Foreman in 1968, representing the United States, winning gold medals in each respective consecutive Olympics. So you probably say, up to this point, those three, Ali, Frazier, and Foreman, had a stranglehold on the heavyweight division, going back to their Olympic days up to this point. And who can really say that if we talk about a heavyweight era? And that's what you had. As George Foreman concluded that run by winning the gold medal in the 1968 Olympics, he himself turned professional and stayed active about as well as he possibly could, basically just knocking everybody out, with the exception of a couple, with the exception of maybe two fighters along the way, amassing a record of 38-0. Excuse me, 37-0 going into this fight with Joe Frazier, and it was his last two fights where against two of his final fights before that came around against guys like Leroy Caldwell and Joe Murphy Goodwin. It was in the middle of all of that where everyone called George Foreman the number one contender for Joe Frazier's title. And that was where everything started to build up for this super event of 53 years ago in Kingston, Jamaica. Now, I always say this about this time, especially the fight community. I'll go ahead and say it again, especially the morons in America, because we have morons in America by default, because boxing fans in America are morons. Joe Frazier was your undefeated heavyweight champion from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. George Foreman was your undefeated number one contender from Marshall, Texas. So where did this fight take place? Kingston, Jamaica, not in the United States. So you morons in America, keep being morons in America, because it don't matter where the fight takes place. This was highly billed, no matter where the fight was going to take place. And where was this taking place? Kingston, Jamaica, at the Independence Center in Kingston, where it's essentially turned out to be a pretty darn solid crowd over there. And I'll touch on the crowd here in a second. The interesting tidbit is, even though he was plowing through the opposition, few of any gave George Foreman a chance in this fight, just simply because of Joe Frazier getting to the point, of course, being the champion. It was pegged as high as a 4-1 favorite. And we think about 4-1 favorites in 1973. It's probably like the equivalent of being a 7-1 or 8-1 favorite today, because Joe Frazier was that kind of a favorite. And even though George Foreman was just plowing through the opposition and doing it effortlessly, there were still a lot of questions about how would George Foreman fare against a guy who would stand up to him. And after he was named the number 1 contender for Joe Frazier, we started to have the buildup, and we talk about how he got to that point. Things started to get real interesting, because at the weigh-in, when they weighed each other, it was George Foreman 217, Joe Frazier 214. But the story of this one was, at the stare down, George Foreman admitted that his knees were shaking, and he was lucky Joe Frazier wasn't looking at his knees. Because you see the stare down at the photos all over the place, how Joe Frazier had to tilt his head up. And here is George Foreman so relaxed and laid back, sitting down, or like relaxed, sitting down, literally like this, almost totally relaxed, as if it was another day in the office for him, and not even being intimidated by Joe Frazier, at least from the chest up. But he said his knees were shaking because he didn't realize how scary of a figure Joe Frazier was. And Joe Frazier, like George Foreman, was intimidating himself. Even though he did intimidate Muhammad Ali, he intimidated a lot of fighters. So that was an interesting storyline when you talk about what's about to take place over at Kingston, Jamaica, 53 years ago tonight. And little did we know, we was about to have a coming out party and an explosion like none other. But getting to that point felt like it took forever, because the ring walks were casual both ways, and they had to put the gloves on in the ring, which is a rare practice back in those days. And we talk about just getting in that ring in a big fight atmosphere. You would think George Foreman would really be nervous, but he was walking into the ring like real effortless, real casual, as if it's about to be another day in the office for him, and Joe Frazier is about to be on his hit list. And this is a 4-1 underdog who openly admitted that he was shaking at the weigh-in when Joe Frazier was looking at him. So it got real interesting. Now, Joe Frazier walking into the ring a bit on the nervous side as he was walking into the ring. And of course, the gloves are getting wrapped up, and we have the introductions. But at the face-off during referees' instructions, George Foreman was just relaxed, and Joe Frazier was moving his shoulders as if something inside him was bothering him. I mean, he was showing in his face, because Joe Frazier's a mighty warrior. We know that. But his body was shaking, moving a bit, having butterflies, while George Foreman just casually looks at him as if he was looking at somebody normal, like it's another day in the office. And little did we know that casual look meant something that was about to come. So we have, after all of that, as the 4-1 underdog, George Foreman, facing the undefeated heavyweight champion, Joe Frazier. It was billed as the Sunshine Showdown, and there it was. So we talk about this particular fight. So early on, because both guys are known for their power, it was a bit of a first-minute face-off, simply because it was a case of who was going to hit who first with their power. When you have two power punchers, the caliber of George Foreman and Joe Frazier, you're going to get a little tedious. I can't say what was going on in their bodies at the time, because I wasn't there. But from the surface, it looked like Frazier was trying to get inside, but Foreman wasn't going to let him. But a minute into this fight, we talk about the first knockdown, a couple of left hands, followed by a perfect right hand uppercut, and Frazier's down on his first knee. And you have heard of the if now famous cliche of Howard Cosell's "Down goes Frazier," in a stunning development that no one could foresee that quickly in the fight. Just a simple uppercut that Frazier simply just went down after one uppercut. And as he got up, here comes an onslaught from Big George Foreman. And we talk about, as a knockdowns was going on, another uppercut sent Frazier on the canvas. And as Frazier got up the second time, Foreman turns to the corner of Joe Frazier and asks him to stop the fight because a beating was starting to get administered and it was about to get worse. And just before the first round ended, Foreman pins Frazier against the ropes, wailing away with lefts and rights. Another uppercut, and Frazier drops to his knees just before round one ends. And Frazier, who came in with that nice style Afro puff, looking like the 1980s or 1970s, 80s soul singers of the R&B era, that hair started becoming a mess because every time George Foreman hit him, hair started to fly. So we end round one, and if you're going to score in a 10-point must system today, that's like a 10-4 round because that's how one-sided George Foreman beat up George Frazier. I mean, back then it was a round system, which Foreman won the round. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But scored on a 10-point must system, it was probably a 10-7, 10-6, maybe even a 10-4 round because it was that brutal of a beating that George Foreman administered to Joe Frazier in that round. And the fact that Frazier survived that round was something within itself. So we talk about moving on to the second round. The onslaught continued as Foreman, maybe the most poignant moment and the most iconic moment of this fight was when Foreman pins Frazier into the corner, just continues to wail away with lefts and rights, uppercuts, hooks, jabs, right crosses, and a one right cross that hurts Frazier. Frazier tries to get out of the corner and literally run from George Foreman. And I mean run. I mean, if you watch that fourth knockdown, you're going to see it. He's in the corner. He tries to get out. As Frazier was getting out, Foreman lands an overhand right, almost like to a spot behind the ear, and Frazier just casually drops. As Frazier was trying to get out of the corner, a right hand right on the ball spot right behind your ear, and Frazier is on the canvas. It wasn't much. It was like the equivalent of knocking on the door, but that knocked Joe Frazier down. And Frazier beat the count. But another iconic moment in that fight, as the referee Arthur McKinney was checking on Joe Frazier, and the ABC the tape delay cameras was zoomed in on Joe Frazier. Foreman comes in, and the image you have is Frazier's head turned sideways after another uppercut hits Joe Frazier by George Foreman. And another uppercut. They trade left hooks. Foreman beats Frazier to the punch. There's knockdown number 5. And at that point, Frazier gets up, and he's getting up real slow, and I mean real slow, and his face starting to show a bit of a beating. At that point, it was a case of when George Foreman wants to end it, and shortly thereafter, he pins Frazier on the ropes, two like half hooks, half uppercuts, and then the right uppercut that lifted a 214-pound man off the canvas, that puts Frazier on his knees, and that was the end of the fight. The second after Frazier went onto his knee and knocked down number 6, ended the most explosive coming out party in heavyweight boxing history, probably the most explosive knockout maybe ever, given all the circumstances. George Foreman hits the pedestal by winning the undisputed heavyweight championship as a 4-1 underdog, shocking the odds by stunning the tough, durable Joe Frazier by knocking him down 6 times in less than 5 minutes to win the championship from Frazier. We can coin the phrase power punchers any way you want. I mean, there's power development when you get older. There's people who have speed as power. Maybe a perfect example of that was a peak Mike Tyson. But when you come into the sport with just pure power, the way George Foreman had, you're going to have a lot of success. And you could probably say, if you talk about just taking a fist, putting a hole through a brick wall, shattering the brick wall, and not damaging your fist type punching power, nobody had that kind of a punching power the same way George Foreman did. And he showed it here 53 years ago in an explosive knockout. And maybe the stutter was not the fact that he beat Joe Frazier, it was the fact he beat Joe Frazier rather effortlessly, as if it was another day in the office and he hardly even broke a sweat. And that's probably the bigger shocker out of all of that. Another thing about this event, and this is for all the modern people out here, this began the debut of a 4.5 decade long tradition, forever known as HBO boxing. I remember back then, they didn't call it HBO's World Championship Boxing or Boxing After Dark. Back then, they go by the long name of Home Box Office Boxing. And that started that trend for the next 4.5 decades after Foreman-Frazier kicked it off. And that started it. The original call was by the great Don Dumphy. The replay version was called by Howard Cosell on ABC. And that spun off the greatest three-word cliche, maybe in pop culture history, Down Goes Frazier, when that first right-hand uppercut by Foreman put Frazier down on the side of his hip. And a shot that nobody saw coming. And that's where Foreman-Frazier became the trendsetter for a lot of things in heavyweight boxing history. We talk about the heavyweight division, the evolution of premium boxing at a time when premium boxing hadn't even gotten started, and this was its debut. If Foreman-Frazier won, opened a lot of things moving forward. And we talk about the careers of both these fighters. I mean, to your top 10 all-time great heavyweights. But we say this a lot of times in the sport, and maybe we need to think about this for a second. We talk about this fight. When you have a grueling fight, like Frazier had against Muhammad Ali, and it was a grueling first fight of March 8, 1971, and then you have this happen to you that's even worse. I mean, you start to creep in doubts, and you start to see the effects, and maybe the effects of what happened on March 8, 1971, when Frazier fought Ali, and it was a grueling fight, started to get beaten out of him just a little, but I don't think that would have mattered because George Foreman was a punching machine who was a man on a mission, and he just beat the bejesus fight out of Joe Frazier, and that night, effortlessly, without even blinking, and to give you that kind of a beating to mess you up psychologically moving forward says a lot about what George Foreman in his first career did to people. And even said himself, not only was I beat you up physically, but you were beaten up mentally, and you were never the same after I delivered the punishment. And Joe Frazier, for only 5 minutes, took a malicious beating. I mean, maybe not the worst beating ever, but it was malicious when you consider the heavy hands of George Foreman and what he was able to do to fighters simply because that's what he was capable of, and that's what he did. And Joe Frazier did manage to fight on. Of course, he had the all-time great trilogy with Muhammad Ali, which is forever the gold standard. The capper, of course, was the Thriller in Manila of October 1, 1975. But after that fight, never could get close anywhere near that level, and actually started to fight a little sporadically, only having the equivalent of 6 fights afterward. He did beat Joe Bugner on points, but lost to Ali in the second fight. Managed to win rematches against Jerry Quarry and Jimmy Ellis before the Thriller in Manila. And of course, there was a rematch that hardly anybody even knows, between Foreman and Frazier in 1976, which Foreman did the same thing to him again, and that was the end. But you probably say it all started with what took place when he met George Foreman the first time, because when you get that kind of a beating, I mean, if we're going to talk about the physical aspects, questions how you are up there. Yeah, Joe Frazier was a tough as nails fighter out of Philadelphia. Everyone in the heavyweight division and the boxing fraternity and all of the boxing historians know this. But on the physical toll, even though it was only 5 minutes, it was one of those kind of beatings that he took that night that probably slowed him down to a point where he wasn't the relentless Joe Frazier he was that paced Jimmy Ellis the first time and Bob Foster before the Ali fight. Because when he paced Foster and Ellis, he was relentless, almost Tyson-like, and just with that vicious left hook, you were gone. Joe Frazier, after the Ali win and the Foreman loss with 2 grueling fights that had the toll beaten out of you, you probably say never got to that point ever again because it was just slowly beaten out of him. And what happened to him 53 years ago tonight was probably one of the nails in the coffin because of how the beating was. And we're fighting a ruthless puncher, the caliber of George Foreman, it'll happen to you. Because I said about many fighters, you don't know what goes through a fighter's psyche when they get hit. And that's what happened with Joe Frazier moving forward after getting beat up by George Foreman the first time. Now to the career and the life of George Foreman. Because we talk about coming out parties, and I'll touch on those here in a second. In terms of heavyweight championship boxing history, this was the coming out party out of all of them. I mean, 4-1 underdog against the undefeated, undisputed champ, who's basically almost 2 years removed from beating Muhammad Ali, and you effortlessly wipe him out in 2 rounds, and it's on the king of the world. It was carried out of the ring as the king of the world, and you become a larger-than-life phenomenon just because of your pure punching power. Now, he made 2 successful title defenses against Jose King Roman and Ken Norton before he lost to Muhammad Ali in Rumble in the Jungle, and we know all the things on that one, and what happened to him afterward, where he was just a mental mess, which they had, of course, the Foreman Fights 5 exhibition, where that was just a disaster, and the Rod Lyle knockdown drag-out match before he lost to Jimmy Young in 1977, and then went into his hiatus. And that was where the transformation of George Foreman from somebody who was a mentally disturbed fighter after the Muhammad Ali loss to something totally different showed. And that's where he became the larger-than-life pop culture icon after the Foreman retired against the loss of Jimmy Young. And that's what happened. Transformed himself, built the Church of Jesus Christ in Houston, Texas, had the George Foreman Youth Center, of course, came back in 1987, softened his way throughout his career, second career till he started to step up against guys like Jerry Cooney and Adelson Rodriguez, knocked them both out in 2 rounds. Of course, got him the title shot against Evander Holyfield in 1991, where he ended all laughter about his comeback. And after that, he managed to lose to Tommy Morrison, but 20 years to today, after he lost the title to Muhammad Ali, 20 years and 6 days later, he had his final shot at the heavyweight title, knocking out Michael Moore in 10 rounds to regain the heavyweight championship and basically re-elevate his status in heavyweight boxing history. And all of that sprung off what took place 53 years ago tonight, because the launching pad was what happened to Kingston when he obliterated Joe Frazier. Everything else that happened to him doesn't happen if that doesn't happen. Because when you have that kind of explosive performance, standing out in front of a nationwide audience like he did, and it was nationwide, and everyone is glued into what you do, you're a pop culture figure. Not only was he a hit sensation of boxing, he was a hit sensation all over the place. I mean, he started having mini commentary gigs with Howard Cosell on ABC. Started having commercials and movies early at that time before the second incarnation where he really had all the endorsements. And it started when he obliterated Joe Frazier, because everything that happened to him in the second incarnation of his career, we're not talking about any of it because we're not, if we don't mention the Joe Frazier fight, because the Joe Frazier fight was the epitome of what George Foreman was in and out of the ring. And you want to talk about a celebrity makeover, that's what George Foreman became after this fight in every single which way possible. I mean, he went from being at the top of the world after he beat Frazier to a mental disturbed human being in a mental mess after losing to Muhammad Ali, to finding himself spiritually in the locker room after the loss to Jimmy Young by his own claims, the church and the youth center, the comeback, and the capper on that comeback was November 5th, 1994, when he knocked out Michael Moore to regain the heavyweight championship of the world 20 years and 6 days later after losing to Ali. And it's fitting he wore those same trunks that night that he wore against Ali when he lost the title in Kinshasa, Zaire. That's the legacy of George Foreman. Of course, the more fight spun off to more endorsements. Of course, the commentator gig with HBO, among many other things. Of course, the grill, which still a hit sensation. It still is. The commercials with Doritos, Pepsi, among many others. Author, philanthropist. Of course, a few years ago, because of the story, the George Foreman movie came out in honor of him, and he loved it. And we talk about pop culture icons, and we can use that phrase loosely in all walks of life. George Foreman's on it because of the makeover he had. From the disturbed human being that didn't want to talk to people to this lovable, bold-headed figure, this jolly old fat man, as what people like to say, just lovable, had a consumer-friendly image. And during his time in the Church of Jesus Christ in Houston, Texas, when he was an evangelist minister, he learned how to sell, and because of it, that's why he was able to sell his comeback the way he did, and he had all the laughs in the end. You can say what you want about George Foreman's career, laugh, negativity, whatever, but he had the last laugh in the end, and that's why he went to the pedestal at the highest level after his comeback. And I said this before, you could talk about his place in history. You can probably say before the comeback, his place in history was questionable because of what happened when he lost to Muhammad Ali. When he regained the championship in his comeback against Michael Moore, you probably say it elevated him. And how many people could say that at the age he did it at 45? In boxing, it's just Archie Moore and Bernard Hopkins. That's the list. And George Foreman was on that list, and he elevated himself as probably a firm top 5, top 6 all-time great heavyweight. And we talk about just the pure power at the heavyweight division, and I mean just pure, take a fist, punch through a brick wall, shatter through the brick wall, and don't mess up the fist type punching power. George Foreman was it. Ernie Shavers might have the closest claim to it, but George Foreman was probably it. And he showed it when he just put a first-class, methodical, brutal beating to the great Joe Frazier 53 years ago tonight in Kinshasa, Zaire, to hit the pedestal and become the heavyweight champion of the world as a 4-1 underdog. That's the phenomenon of George Foreman. They said that we're not talking about anything else about what George Foreman did without this, because this was the springboard that started it. And we talk about coming out parties in the heavyweight division, and boy, we have quite a few of them. Maybe not quite like his, but we had quite a few of them. Well, let's start with I'm not going to go in chronological order, but I'm going to go through some of them here. Maybe the stunner, maybe the biggest upset at the time was when James J. Braddock stunned Max Baer. You guys know James J. Braddock, a.k.a. Cinderella Man, as a 10-1 underdog, gave Max Baer a boxing lesson to win the heavyweight title. And after that point, after Braddock fought Joe Louis called this guy champ. That's a coming out party. A bigger stunner than what Foreman did to Frazier. But maybe the stunner of Foreman-Frazier was how he did it, as opposed to who won it, but how he beat Joe Frazier. Braddock Baer was the real stunner, and this is before a couple of the other ones I'm going to talk about here in a second. There's, of course, Floyd Patterson, when he just obliterated Archie Moore to win the heavyweight title, at the time the youngest to ever win it. And he probably had a second coming out party when he got the title back from Ingmar Johansson and became the first ever to regain the heavyweight title. So Patterson may have two of those coming out parties of his own, but the real one, you could probably say, was what took place in 1956 when he just blasted out Archie Moore at Chicago Stadium to win the heavyweight title. At the time, the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. The champion before him, Rocky Marciano, what he did to Jersey Joe Walcott the first time. Excuse me, and remember, Walcott had that fight under control until that iconic right cross that turned Walcott's face sideways and put him down and out for the count. And the road was introduced to Rocky Marciano at that point. There's another coming out party in the heavyweight division. And we know the career of Rocky Marciano at that point, always going to be nitpicked, but he fought and beat everybody in front of him, so you have to give him that. Of course, maybe the one that had the more coming out parties Joe Louis. I mean, when he knocked out Primo Carnera, I mean, that was when the role was introduced to him. When he beat James J. Braddock after Braddock upset Max Baer, and that basically he became the heavyweight champion of the world in a fight where, he just pummeled Braddock until that trademark right cross finished him in the 8th round. But maybe the real coming out party for him after that was the one he wanted, the iconic rematch of June 22, 1938, when he just beat down Max Schmeling in one round, almost similar to the way George Foreman beat down Joe Frazier, but maybe more significant given everything that took place in the political landscape of the sport. So Joe Louis had quite a few of these coming out parties. Maybe the top three for him: Primo Carnera, James J. Braddock, and the big one, the rematch against Max Schmeling. I alluded to Patterson's fight with Archie Moore. Ingemar Johansson, when he beat Floyd Patterson to win the heavyweight title, where he just floored, every time he hit Patterson, he floored him. And the world was introduced to a Swedish sensation. And Ingemar Johansson, we talk about some of the underrated all-time great heavyweights who are underrated. Johansson's on that list. Very underrated, who could fight with anybody because he had a punch. And of course, that spun off to Patterson's second coming out party when he starts Johansson with a left hook to become the first ever in boxing history in that heavyweight division to regain the heavyweight championship, which was never done before. Of course, you could also say the greatest, Muhammad Ali. Back then, he was known as Cassius Clay, as a 6-1 underdog against the so-called baddest man on the planet, Sonny Liston, giving Sonny Liston such a boxing lesson to where the so-called most feared fighter at the time, maybe ever, is Sonny Liston, quit on the stool. And not only gave a boxing lesson, the first few rounds he gave a boxing lesson. The remaining rounds before Sonny Liston quit, he gave Liston a beating, and Liston just sat on the stool. And we know what spun off of that rematch with the whatever punch that landed but didn't. But there's another coming out party, and that spun him off to the role of the greatest. Of course, he had a boatload of those, being Ali, the Thrilla in Manila, and the Rumble in the Jungle, just to name a few. But the real coming out party for him was what took place in 1964 when he just gave Sonny Liston a boxing lesson and then made him quit by giving him a beating afterwards. James Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson. I'll be touching about this in a few weeks. Everybody knows the story about this one. 42-1. 3 weeks after his mom died, goes into Tokyo, Japan, nothing to lose, and just begludgeons the so-called baddest man on the planet, and kicks off a wild run of the 90s heavyweights, and he was the one that jump-started it when he just pummeled Mike Tyson to the tune of an 10th round knockout to win the heavyweight championship. Forever probably the greatest one-hit wonder in all of society when you think about what he did on that night. So there's another coming out party. Many, many more in the heavyweight division. But I add another one. I talked about Sonny Liston, the way he obliterated Floyd Patterson twice in one round to win the heavyweight title. He had two coming out parties. The same guy, same result, 1-round knockouts. And that was at a time when nobody wanted to fight Sonny Liston. So there's another coming out party. I can point to a boatload of these. Some of them had more significance than others. But maybe the most explosive coming out party that opened the eyes to everybody and set off a long run in more ways than one was what took place 53 years ago tonight in Kingston, Jamaica, as an undefeated number one contender, George Foreman, as a 4-1 underdog, just beat down and just pummeled the undisputed heavyweight champion, Joe Frazier, in 5 minutes to win the heavyweight championship of the world. And one of the more explosive short beatings, one-sided beatings you're probably ever going to see. And it touched off many things. Talks about how it touched off the phenomenon that's George Foreman from his first career to his retirement to his second career. World heard the greatest 3-word cliche in maybe sports commentator history. Down goes Frazier from the late Howard Cosell, who called this fight on the ABC replay version of the fight. And the world was introduced to a phenomenon that lasted 4.5 decades, known as HBO's boxing, Now, back then, it wasn't World Championship Boxing or Boxing After Dark. Back then, it was the traditional long word, home box office boxing. That's what it was called. But that, spun off the 4.5 decade run of phenomenal fights on that network. We spun off to World Championship Boxing, Boxing After Dark. And we know what the phenomenon was till they closed its doors in 2018. But Foreman-Frazier kicked that off. And Foreman-Frazier won of 1973, kicked off a lot of things for a long, long time. Not only was it the careers of both, but many things in the sport of boxing in ways that no one could see coming when you look back at it in hindsight, because that's what it was. And what George Foreman did on this night, we'll probably not see anything that explosive again, because we've seen some as explosive before and after what Foreman did to Frazier, but not quite like that, because George Foreman spun it off to becoming one of the real pop culture icons to ever grace the God's green earth. And I'm not talking about just boxing. I'm talking about maybe all sports, all entertainment, whatever you want to name it. Because after the loss of Ali, it became a mental mess, and then did the total makeover during his 10 years out. Everybody wanted to talk to George Foreman because he was so lovable. That's the legacy of Foreman-Frazier 1. Kicked off many, many iconic circumstances, introduced us to a lot of cliches, among many other things. And it was 53 years ago tonight, the road was introduced. We're probably never going to see a fight that transcendent as many ways as that was, because a lot of doors were opened, and those doors that opened stayed open for a long, long time when you think about it. Because, we don't have HBO anymore. I mean, unfortunate. They don't, Showtime eventually closed its doors. We know that. And a lot of people want to talk about HBO's run in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Yes. But we're not talking about HBO boxing if we didn't have Foreman-Frazier on that network, because that's what started everything in the sport of boxing. You'd probably say it took it to a newer landscape. And when it took to that newer landscape, it stayed put, and it captivated the souls of any fight fan, anyone who worked in the fight game, and got you glued to it, because it was a unique culture for the longest time. And it started here. I mean, I said it was HBO World Championship Boxing. It was then they called it the long version of it, home box office boxing. And we know what happened, how it catapulted to the back end of the 70s throughout to when they closed their doors in 2018. We're not talking about HBO boxing if this didn't take place. And even though it was a one-sided beating, if I can put the words correctly, the one that captured your mind and your soul and got you glued, if you was a fight fan, or even a general sports fan. I mean, you have to just be a boxing fan. You can be a general sports fan, because it was at that time, you wasn't just drawing hardcore fight fans. You was drawing casual fans every single which way possible, and that's why that night spun off to many, many things over the next several years. And we're not talking about that road with HBO without this, because it started it. Yes, there are probably bigger events, bigger fights down the line because of how the fight game was selling later on down the line. And I'm not going to argue against that. But when you have the kickoff, something that kicks off a massive mainstream phenomenon like this did with Howard Cosell's cliche, the entrance of HBO boxing, you establish something legacy-wise, and it stays forever. May God rest the souls of Howard Cosell, George Foreman, and Joe Frazier. You guys started it 53 years ago tonight in Kingston, Jamaica, and the phenomenon continued for the longest time. And we're not talking about anything. We talk about the careers of both, specifically George Foreman, and the fight game the way it is without this fight, because a lot of iconism started, and it carried on, a massive storm in a good way over the next several decades. That's a legacy of Foreman-Frazier 1, the Sunrise Showdown that took place 53 years ago tonight in Kingston, Jamaica. And George Foreman may have had the biggest and most impactful coming out party when you think about what he did to the great Joe Frazier. And even George Foreman said for the longest time, I can't believe I did it. I mean, he even said, I can't believe I did it to this guy. I was scared. I mean, he even said at the weigh-in, his knees were shaking. His knees were shaking. And he said, I still can't believe I knocked this guy down 6 times in less than 5 minutes. He still can't believe it. And maybe we should have seen it when we look back in retrospect because of how George Foreman was. But maybe we shouldn't, in the way he did it, we consider how Joe Frazier was doing a similar thing. And as I said in a clip I had when I did a show last year, you talk about the irresistible force, and you talk about the immovable object. In this case, the irresistible force and the immovable object, at the end of the day, was probably George Foreman. And that's why he was the one-of-a-kind phenomenon. Not only stepped foot in the boxing ring, but stepped foot in the sports world, the entertainment world, and in the pop culture world. And when they say you're one of a kind, that fit George Foreman to mere perfection. May God rest his soul, as well as Joe Frazier, Howard Cosell, among many others who were around those corners and that event on that night. And on that note, that'll wrap up this edition of Sir Hunt on X. No show tomorrow night, but a special show Saturday night as an all-time great Slugfest celebrates its 50th anniversary, and I will recap that night. As always, if you missed this show or any others, you can catch them on the Apple Podcast, the iHeartRadio, and my Patreon apps. And if you want the video version to see this thing, you can catch it on X, Facebook, and Spotify. And as always, make self-care your number one priority in all walks of life. Take care of yourself first. Don't let anyone step on your boundaries, and respect other people's boundaries, and all the good things will happen. Don't let anyone walk on your boundaries, because nothing else is going to matter at that point. And for those of you on the X platform, I will be live on X Spaces here in a matter of minutes with the NFL Gridiron to talk about the Championship Sunday coming up. If you want to listen to me on that platform, I will be there. Sponsored by the great people at Wager Wire, James McMahon and those guys. I love the hell out of them. I'm back tonight. And on that note, have a good rest of the night. Take care of yourselves. God bless. Enjoy the rest of the evening. For those of you in Cincinnati, stay warm and stay safe because a cold front is coming. And I'll see everybody Saturday night.